What is this? What is this? We are doing, let's see, the Fallacy from the Owl of Minerva to the Lark of Roulette by Andrew Aberdein in Argumentation. So, see what this is about. And as always, anyone in chat, please feel free to chime in with any questions you have. Here's the, sorry, did not throw the link in chat. You can always type !paper. If you're watching later on YouTube, the link will be below. So, what'd I just do? There we go. Okay, so here we go. Introduction. Several authors have proposed a fallacy, but not all their proposals take the same form. Hence, for William Lycan, the fallacy is that of inputting fallaciousness to a view with which one disagrees, but without doing anything to show that the view rests on any error in reasoning. Okay, so this is just accusing someone of making a reasoning mistake. So you're just being like, you're wrong, you're reasoning poorly. And doing that is it's kind of like an ad hominem. I guess you're attacking a person. So that's cool. I mean, it's cool, like, just as a general thing. Don't attack people if, like, no reason to be like to do that. But it's like, you know, it's what it is. It's an ad hominem. You're attacking their reasoning ability for maybe not good reasons, because that's what they're saying. They don't do it. They don't have a explanation of what's going on. Okay, similar definitions include improperly connecting a fallacy with an argument so that the argument is errantly presumed to be debunked, and the fallacy of thinking that something is a fallacy when it isn't. The Reddit technique of arguing, yeah, it's basically saying you're stupid and you're wrong and you argue bad, and therefore you should feel bad. Yeah, I've used to post on Reddit more, and I very rarely post on Reddit anymore. It's just not worth trying to explain people in that format. Yeah, it's not worth it most of the time. Okay. Such flagging up of fallaciousness on insufficient grounds is a type 1 error with respect to fallacy detection. The teaching of fallacy theory is chiefly concerned with the type 2 error, that of letting insidious fallacies pass for good argument. Thus, the fallacy represents a salutary warning against overcorrection. However, other authors have defined the fallacy differently, as the unwarranted inference that the conclusion of a fallacious argument must be false. Okay, so you're saying you're wrong for the right reasons because the argument's false, but that doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion actually happens to be false. It just means you're reasoning poorly. That doesn't actually mean that you have a bad view. It just means you were right, but for the wrong reasons. So if you're right for the wrong reasons, it's like that's a different thing. Okay, so this includes Christian Cotton, which seems to be the first and standalone treatment of the fallacy. It occurs when one reasons that because the argument for some conclusion is fallacious, the conclusion of that argument is false. And Scott Aiken, who we've read here before, Scott Aiken, I believe in Philosophy Roulette before. One commits the fallacy when one identifies a fallacy in an interlocutor's argument and thereby takes this as a reason to reject their conclusion. Again, this is kind of a ad hominem where you're attacking the person. You're saying because you are not able to reason, we should discount your conclusions. Now, of course, if someone's making dumb arguments, that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong in the end. It just means that maybe you don't want to listen to them and how they argue. But it'd be interesting because sometimes people argue very dumbly, but that doesn't make them have bad positions. So this happens a lot in political things. You may think your colleague is a moron, but they're on your team and they have they hold the same political views that you do. And so you don't really care that they're a moron and argue poorly because you think they are in the end correct. And you see this in it. I guess I'd assume in all countries, politicians, but you definitely see that here in the United States. Okay, the fallacy thus exhibits an individuation problem akin to that John Wood's diagnoses in ad hominem arguments. Yeah, exactly. ad hominem. He schematizes the general ad hominem strategy as follows. Sarah makes her ad hominem retort. She concludes from this that the adequacy of her opponent's case is called into doubt. She concludes from this that her opponent's case doesn't work, that there is reason to think that her interlocutor's position is false. Yeah, I mean, if this is the only reason you think that their position is false because they screwed up reasoning, that'd be weak. You probably would need some more, reasons to say that they're wrong. The fact that someone argues poorly doesn't mean, like, in the end, that they are completely wrong. I've been right for the wrong reasons lots of times. Like, it just happens. Like, I screw up the description, but that didn't make me hold the wrong position. I just screwed up my argumentation. Because, I forget things. Happens. Okay, Woods remarks that his three-part scheme that some people are of the view that an argument ad hominem is constituted by all three components, the retort of 1 and the inferences of 2 and 3. So understood, an ad hominem begins with 1 and ends with 3. So that's just what the ad hominem is. That you think because they argue poorly and they're idiots that they just happen to have wrong conclusions. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair position. Others are of the view that the ad hominem has a slighter constitution, one that begins with 1 and ends with 2. Okay. We should also notice that Woods is scrupulous, as some of the sources cited above are not to distinguish the determination of fallaciousness from the identification of a specific pattern of argument. As he remarks, for most fallacies X, it is possible to specify arguments that instantiate X, which nevertheless are not fallacious. Yeah, like, fallacies are not universal. People have to remember this. Like, you can use certain arguments at certain times that are less bad. Like, other times they'd be bad, but sometimes they are less bad. One of the times you might think this, like, if like someone is arguing ethical principles and they are a terrible person, you'd say, well, why should we listen to you about what ethics is? And they say, well, I'm a terrible person, so I understand better. It's like, do you really? Then why would, like, how do you understand this well and then you don't do the right thing? Like, what is going on at that point? So if like someone's a terrible person, why would you listen to them about ethics? It's like, this is the sort of thing. Like, if someone's a really bad artist or like a really bad cook, would you ask them about food? Now, full disclosure, this was someone was saying this just yesterday or 2 days ago on a stream I watched where the guy eats almost nothing. He's OCD. Frank, big time welcome in. Yeah, sometimes the slopes are really slippery. They really are. But like, this is funny. So he was saying, look, you can judge his opinion because he eats nothing because he's OCD, and because he's completely objective. It's like, no, I'm not judging your food. He was saying it tongue-in-cheek. He knows he's not a food critic. But it's like he was saying it tongue-in-cheek because he was completely objective about it. But it's like he just does not experience a lot of food because, you know what? He refuses to eat certain things with certain textures because he just is... He can't do it for, whatever reason. It's not a big deal. He eats certain foods and not others. So it's like, so what if it's... He's objective. Like, he can't make the claim to having the requisite experience. And so attacking the person's character at that point for saying, oh yeah, I can do it because I'm objective. It's like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Your reasoning is like weak. And like, because you don't know what you're talking about. So like ad hominems, I actually don't hate them all the time because it's like, sometimes it, like, if in the certain circumstances, it can matter for that stuff. Frank says, but once you start making slippery slope arguments, it gets hard to stop, and soon all your arguments are slippery slopes. Is that the case? I don't think so, but yeah, I get your point. It's like, you can't really just say everything. No, but I know it's a joke, but even so, there are like distinguishing things about like when you're reasoning in different ways, so... It's like, yeah, but this is what the whole point is. Like, when someone is making a claim in a certain area, sometimes their character is relevant to that claim, and so it's all of a sudden like they make one little mistake here and then it looks worse and worse and worse. Sometimes that makes a difference. Like, it's not every time, but it will happen sometimes. And maybe you can say, all right, is that a slippery slope anymore when it's just in that one time? Maybe not, but it will look like a slippery slope argument. So I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes things look like slippery slope arguments, but the reason why it's not a fallacy may be because of that one time. There is other things going on. Yeah. Okay, so the author says, in this spirit I shall henceforth henceforth refer to fallacy schemes when it is not determined whether a given case is fallacious. Yeah, so there's fallacy schemes, but you don't actually know if they're bad, if they're fallacious. So, yeah, and how you doing, Frank? Big time. Thanks for stopping by. I'm getting a little paper on fallacies. So, better than metaphysics, I figured. Aloha, yes. Are you Hawaiian? You can be like mahalo. The resemblance of Wood's scheme to the fallacy scheme is immediate. Indeed, we could adopt it as a characterization of the fallacy scheme with one amendment. Keeping 2 and 3, but substituting 1 prime for 1. So, Sarah makes her fallacy diagnosis. So this is basically, it's not an ad hominem, but instead now we're talking about the fallacy, accusing other people of making fallacies. So she makes a fallacy diagnosis. Frank Big Time says, you're not Hawaiian. Okay, but your brother started saying a long time ago, and I picked up from him. I couldn't stop saying it when he did. You know, it's a nice saying, like aloha. It's like, you know, I think it is a very friendly way to say hi. There was the old joke in The Simpsons, and it was actually from the history of telephones, where Mr. Burns picks up the phone and he goes, ahoy hoy, because the original, like Alexander Graham Bell wanted a specific greeting for telephone stuff as opposed to hello or aloha. He says ahoy hoy, and so he'd be like ahoy hoy. Anyway, but yeah, it's aloha's nice. Okay, so this is the scheme about accusing people of making fallacies, whether you're right or not. So Sarah makes her fallacy diagnosis. She concludes from this that the adequacy of her opponent's case is called into doubt. She concludes from this that there is reason to think that her interlocutor's position is false. We may see from the first sort of fallacy discussed above runs from 1 prime to 2, and the second from 1 prime to 3. In order for the former to be a fallacy, Sarah's diagnosis must be an error. Indeed, if the diagnosis is correct, the step from 1 to 2, 1 prime to 2, is a normal process of fallacy recognition. So if you're right about it, then you can say, look, they didn't argue correctly if they made a fallacy. That's the definition of it. But if they're wrong, then, you know, that's a different, then you have wrongly accused them and you've made the fallacy in your fallacy, being wrong about diagnosing what went wrong about someone else's argument. Okay, this makes the fallacy scheme central to the application of fallacy theory. This constraint does not apply to instances of the latter type. The step from 2 to 3 is unwarrantedly independent of the status of 1 prime. Evolve yourself. How you doing? What's going on? What are we reading? We're reading a paper in argumentation about the fallacy. So if, like, I accuse you of making a fallacy and I'm wrong about it, well, then what have I done? And it's a kind of an ad hominem they've started off saying here, and they're kind of analyzing what it is, this sort of an ad hominem attack, to say, look, Evolve Yourself TV is reasoning fallaciously, they're reasoning incorrectly, so we can ignore what they're saying. They haven't gotten anywhere. They're just sort of mapping out the style of argument here. So, like, it's going from ad hominem up here to a fallacy diagnosis down here, and there's the only difference between 1 and 1 prime. So they're talking about that. For anyone else in chat, if you do not know Evolve Yourself is one of the philosophy streamers here on Twitch.tv. He's a buddy of mine. He's out in Chicago. He does mind, metaphysics, epistemology. Also, but mostly on his stream, you can talk philosophy with him. But you can also, he's a chess instructor. Excellent chess player, teaches chess. He goes over chess games, analyzes them, feels smart about chess. Also, but his main content is meditation and like chakra balancing. So you get a whole, like, he's much more holistic than me. And so you can go there, you relax, you get yourself centered, and you feel better. So it's a great stream. So anyone watching on YouTube, come on over to Twitch. It's nice. Go hang out with Evolve Yourself. But yeah. So, hope you're well, Evolve Yourself. Yeah, so this is what we're doing. It's a short paper. It's only like 10, 11 pages or whatever. So we're going to find out what the actually fallacy is. And we can talk about, like, you know, what it is to reason incorrectly. Because not all the time, you know, I was saying earlier, I think before you were here, not all fallacies, and they note this too, are, you can use them sometimes. Every so often, saying something that would look like a fallacious argument isn't always a fallacious argument. And I always harp on ad hominems. I think sometimes you can claim someone's a bad person and therefore their conclusions should not be listened to. Like, whatever they're saying, they're a terrible person, so like, why would you listen to their ethics? If they're a terrible person, what would they know about ethics being a terrible person? It's like, maybe they know something, but like, really, they're not the people you should be listening to. Well, you're alright. That's good. My world is very weird, so I'm like, I don't even know what I am. I'm like, I'm okay or something. Alright. We may see that the first sort of fallacy... Oh, no. This is what we did. Yeah, so the only difference here is the fallacy diagnosis. So how you get from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 matters when you say you're accusing someone of making a fallacy. The other stuff is all the same. Okay, continuing. At least since the work of John Pollock, epistemologists have distinguished 2 ways of attacking an inference as undercutting, which challenges the connection between the premises and the conclusion, and rebutting, which challenges the conclusion directly. As I have observed elsewhere, 2 is an undercutter and 3 is a rebutter, so the 3-component ad hominem is undercutting and rebutting variety, and the slighter 2-component ad hominem is solely undercutting. Okay, so let's call them AHR and AHU. So we've got the R for rebut and undercutting. If Avicelli says, what about a metaphysician with a big ego? Should we listen to them if their arguments are cogent? You know, I'd say not always. Depends what their arguments are about. If they're telling you about how people should be, like, humble in the world, and they have a giant ego, like, their relationship to other people, I would not, that would be a time to call them out at that point. It's like, what would you know about, like, your, like, relating to other people with your massive ego? And, like, is that an ad hominem? Because it would look like they don't actually know the proper way to interact with other people. You have to give people a chance because people come from different parts of the world, have different, like, histories, and so you might not know what they're bringing to the table, and you may, with your ego, not realize it. If they're talking about the ways, like, people relate to each other, and they're like that's a metaphysical topic, how I relate to you as a person, you know, then ego, it would be like, it'd be hard to believe them. A logician with a big ego, again, like, so for the metaphysician, I could see that relating to them. A logician with a big ego, I deal with a lot of logicians in my time. I've dealt with a bunch of them. Generally the good ones don't have big egos. They're not assholes. The crappier ones think they're brilliant. How would you call out a logician with a big ego? Frankly, what they're gonna do, in my experience, is they're gonna try to bop you over the head with technical crap. Frankly, it's just not worth it to deal with them. I wouldn't call them out on that. I'd just not deal with them. Let someone else deal with it at that point. It's just not worth it. Let them go off in their corner. It's like, yeah, it's very hard to call out logicians if they're talking about logic and you just can't do the technical stuff they want to talk about. But like, yeah, I mean, if you have like a more specific question about that, like, I might be able to answer if I knew more about it, but like, a logician with a big ego is probably just a douchebag and not worth your time. Yeah. Let's see. I know people with big egos. You just got to keep them focused on the actual material. If you can keep them focused on the actual material and not on, like, them self-aggrandizing, then, you know, like, then you can get some productive discussion out of them. But if they just, like, fall back on their normal, I'm so great and brilliant and this is why because I said all this stuff, it's like, then they're just repeating themselves and they're kind of useless. It's like, why are you talking to them? Just go spend your time with better people. And, like, yeah, that's... I'm sorry. It's easy when you're not in philosophy to be like, I'm just not spending my time with you. And so it's like, I'm not an academic. So I'm just like, I'm not going to deal with you if I don't have to. That's it. In New York, there are people with big egos. And, yeah, like, I deal with them sometimes. But most of the time, they're like, the philosophers here are okay. Sometimes they're a little egotistical, but, like, you know, you work around it. You just gotta stick to the argumentation then. It's like, yeah, don't let them get all ego on you. Just keep them focused. You have to, to keep them in their lane, man. Stay in your lane. Okay, so we got the rebut and the undercut arguments. AH, rebut, AH, undercut. So, likewise, the two-component fallacy scheme is an undercutting attack, where the three-component fallacy scheme is an undercutting and rebutting attack. So, rebut and undercut. Call them FSU and FSR. So we've got fallacy scheme and then the ad hominem scheme. So you can undercut ad hominems, rebut them or undercut them, and you can also do undercut, which is challenge the argumentation, and rebut is to challenge the conclusion. So that's for the fallacy scheme and ad hominem, even though the fallacy is a version of ad hominem. An inference may be undercut but not rebutted if its conclusion holds for other reasons, so not every undercutter is a rebut. Yeah. Strictly speaking, inferences may also be rebutted but not undercut by challenging the conclusion without giving any grounds for disputing the argument's cogency. However, insofar as a rebut derives the falsehood of its conclusion from an alleged inferential weakness, every rebut must be an undercut. Yeah, so if you're going to say, look, your conclusion fails for this reason, then it also is going to undercut the argument more generally. The close relationship between the fallacy scheme and the ad hominem is perhaps unsurprising. The fallacy is to non-agent-based argument appraisal, what an ad hominem is to agent-based argument appraisal. Yeah, it seems like this is just a specification of one's a specification of the other. If the fallacy detection is to serve any useful purpose, there must be some case of undercutting of the fallacy that are not fallacious. Similarly, if an agent-based and a fortiori, a virtue-theoretic account of argument appraisal is to do any work, there must be a case of ad hominem undercutting that are not fallacious. They're stronger and less defensible cousins. The fallacy rebut and the ad hominem rebut are immaterial to the defense of either sort of appraisal, since no part of the appraisal of an inference to determine that its conclusion is false. Yeah, if you can just say, look, your conclusion of your argument is true, but you've got something, but like that means you've screwed up your argumentation somewhere else. You're right, but for the wrong reasons. Then we're not talking about this. We're not talking about being right for the wrong reasons. You have to be accusing someone of being wrong, and they're wrong, and it's because the argument is screwed up. Okay, in the next section I will discuss some anticipations of the fallacy that provide yet another possible reading. In section 3, addresses the Owl of Minerva problem and a broader phenomenon which the fallacy and its relatives exemplify. In section 4, we will see that this problem also afflicts the practice of charging others with vices, including vices of argument. Lastly, section 5 discusses a possible remedy. Okay, this is what we're doing. We've got, let's see, so we got about 10 pages to go. No, 7 pages. Nothing too killer. Talking about argumentations. Yeah, and I hope you weren't talking about me having too big of an ego. I'm sure my ego it could use some work. But let me know if I've been a dickhead. I try not to be. I don't always succeed. Okay, anticipations. The fallacy is anticipated in Schopenhauer's Art of Controversy, in which errors of reasoning are ironically proposed as advice to the unscrupulous arguer. Should your opponent be in the right, but luckily for your contention, choose a faulty proof, you can easily manage to refuse it and then claim that you have thus refuted his whole position. This is a trick which ought to be one of the first. I was not the object of reference, thank you. I was just thinking, have I been a dick? Maybe I was, I hope not. Yeah. So Schopenhauer's trick is explicitly a rebut, yes. He also links to an ad hominem argument. It is at bottom an expedient by which an argument ad hominem is put forward as an argumentum ad rem. I don't know what rem is, I should probably know the Latin, but everyone should get the point from the context here. You're just tricking someone to say their conclusion's wrong just because they argued incorrectly, even if the conclusion happens to be right. You're saying if they're right for the wrong reasons, you're just saying they're wrong because they didn't get the right reasons. Yeah, they're wrong for the wrong reason. No, it's right for the wrong reasons, and then you're saying, well, it's actually wrong because they have the wrong reasons. Okay, for Schopenhauer, an ad hominem shows that some proposition is inconsistent with other statements or admissions of our opponent, whereas an ad rem shows that the proposition is not in accordance with the nature of things. Okay, hence Schopenhauer does not draw the connection to the arguer's character typical of more recent accounts of ad hominem. Okay, so rem must be like the nature of things, like the world. Okay, interesting. So it's basically completely wrong is what you're saying. It's going from the argument was wrong to the whole thing is wrong, which is not in accordance with the world. Okay. The character of the arguer receives direct attention in a more recent anticipation of the fallacy from another classic work of fallacy theory, David Hackett Fisher's Historian's Fallacies. He designates the fallacist fallacy as any of the following profoundly wrong propositions. 1. An argument which is structurally fallacious in some respect is therefore structurally false in all respects. 2. An argument which is structurally false in some respect, or even in every respect, is therefore substantively false in its conclusion. 3. The appearance of a fallacy in an argument is an external sign of its author's depravity. 4. Sound thinking is merely thinking which is not fallacious. 5. Fallacies exist independent of particular purposes and assumptions. Okay, propositions 1 and 2 closely represent the undermining and rebutting, respectively. The resemblance is not exact since their antecedents exclude wholly blameless inferences. The other propositions also represent salutary warnings. Proposition 4 cautions that the theory of argument is not exhausted by fallacy theory, and Proposition 5 reminds us that classification of fallacies are only possible within broader theoretical contexts. Fisher's example is the dependence of Aristotle's fallacy of Axon on the distinction in his metaphysics between essential and accidental properties. Okay, Proposition 3 holds much greatest interest. Don't know what that sentence is. Notably, we may disaggregate it into two components, each of which rewards separate study. 3a. An arguer's fallacies are evidence of the arguer's persistent dispositions, and 3b. The persistent dispositions responsible for fallacies are moral vices. Yeah, so this is basically saying the person who argues badly is depraved, and the depravity is broken up into saying it's a disposition and it's of a moral disposition. Okay, Proposition 3a could be taken as an instance of what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. This error of ignoring situational factors and overconfidently assuming that distinctive behaviors or pattern of behavior are due to an agent's distinctive character traits is one of the most significant challenges to virtue theories. Yeah, I mean, you can always, because you could say someone is a criminal, or you could say they committed a crime. And it's like, well, are they a criminal, like, fundamentally? It's like, that doesn't, what do you know of the person, really? You know what they did once. It's like, yeah, they stole something one time. Does that make them, like, inherently a criminal? It's like, that's excessive. You don't know that much about people, or that person, usually. Okay, the Situationist Critique has thus been the subject of considerable discussion. Elsewhere, I've suggested how virtue theories of argument may respond. One major weakness of the critique is that the fundamental attribution error relies on a behaviorist conception of character traits. Virtue theorists from Aristotle onward typically make clear that virtues are not just rote reactions to specific stimuli, they are situation responsive. It's like, this is the thing. If someone steals something, or they starving, or they, did they need to steal something to save someone's life? Like, what was the situation responsive thing? Like, that's the thing. Are they a criminal because they stole food to, save someone's life? Like, did you break into a place to get, like, some medical supplies? Like, does that make you a criminal? I mean, or is that going to say something terrible about the person? It may not be every time what you think it is, Okay. Our present concern is with vices, but similar considerations apply. Psychologically realistic vices are also situation responsive and thereby predict most, but not all, behavior. So if Proposition 3a is interpreted as attributing fallacies to behaviorist character traits, it is indeed an instance of the fundamental attribution error, but it is not a thesis any virtue theorist need defend. On the other hand, if Proposition 3a is interpreted as taking fallacies as evidence, however weak, of situation-responsive vices, then it is consistent with a virtue theory, but evades the situationist critique. By contrast, Proposition 3b is straightforwardly false. It links failure of arguments to failure of moral character. This is a tempting but fundamentally mistaken misreading of the virtue program of argument analysis. As I have stressed elsewhere, only argumentative vices should be seen as relevant to the appraisal of arguments. Thus, the virtue program does not claim to ground the analysis of argument in the arguer's moral virtues or vices. Indeed, this is an error which the virtue program can help expose. This is interesting. This guy has a whole thing about virtues and vices of argumentation. I guess the vices then are, you screw up certain things for certain reasons at certain times. It's not a character trait, but like you just have to get better at arguing because you have in a certain situation made certain bad moves in your argumentation. So that's kind of interesting that this is where this author goes, is that if you're going to talk about why people use certain arguments in certain times, maybe they have some bad habits that need to be corrected, but this is not a moral characteristic. It's like, at these times people are just misapplying what they should be doing. And you can see how that happens. Like, at any given time, you may misapply some tools. Like, you may use the wrong tool for the job. And that's not a moral failing or a persistent disposition. It may just be something that you have to learn. This is not what you do at this time. But you can pick that out and, you can correct that. Of course, is a mistaken use of a hammer when you should have been like a Phillips head when you should have been a flathead when you should have been using a Phillips head screwdriver. Is that a moral vice that you're doing that? No, that's silly. But that would also mean it's like, look, you're using the wrong screwdriver. You have to learn which screwdriver to use for the right kind of screw. Okay, so this error can be brought into clearer focus by looking at some of the close logical relatives of Proposition 3. The contrapositive of Proposition 3 states that evidence of an author's moral righteousness is evidence that the arguments are free from fallacy. Yes, that's right. I argue well, therefore I'm morally correct. This treatment of the moral status of an arguer as support for the cogency of their arguments or the truth of their conclusions is what Jamie White has termed morality fever, under which heading he includes the ideas that you can't argue with the morally sincere, that caring licenses irrationality, and that sincerity may be substituted for reason. Yes, it is interesting. Like, this is like, you just because you're so sincere that makes your arguments okay. Nah, that's not how everything. The evidence of an author's moral righteousness. Yeah, that doesn't mean like just because you're really sincere about what you say doesn't mean what you're saying makes any sense. That's funny. Okay, I like this morality fever. That's a cutesy term. Like, you get the author at least gets a kudos for quoting a cutesy term. I like cutesy terms in philosophy. Morality fever. That's nice. Because like you can say that nowadays with politicians. You can say, look, I think that what they're saying in the end is right, even though they're speaking gibberish. It's like we've got morality fever. You think just because you morally agree with them that their arguments make sense. Nah, that doesn't make any sense. But like, that's funny. It's kind of a fever of morality. You think the morality makes something right. Okay, the converse of proposition states, evidence of an author's depravity is evidence that their arguments are fallacious. This bears some resemblance to Lawrence Power's version of the ad hominem. The opponent is regarded as evil, deceitful, and diabolically clever. Therefore, we had better not listen to the opponent's arguments. We listen to such arguments at our peril. None of these theses follow from a virtue-theoretic approach to the appraisal of arguments. Okay, again, authors hammering their pet theory here that argumentation is a virtue-based system. And that's an interesting thing. Like, really, do you actually think that, like, the way you argue is a virtue? Like, that you've got, like, the virtue of arguing well? I'm not so sure that this is, like, revolve yourself. Like, what if you got, like, a really jerk-faced logician who never screws up their argumentation? Like, do they have some virtues of argumentation then? Maybe, but it seems very strange to have extreme virtues in one area, like argument in like logical reasoning, and then none in other areas. So it seems virtue theories can be abused. This criticism of being like virtuous is there's ways to abuse virtue theories. What I'm saying here is actually a little unfair to the theory, because virtue theories always have the problem of assholes. You can always be really, really good at something but that really thing you're good at, like that virtue, can be at like ignoring all the other virtues, which is a bad thing. But like that, it allows people to be like, well, whatever you're gonna be good at it. Well, what if you're really good at being a dickhead? Like, if that's what you're gonna be and you're gonna be the best at it, you're gonna be the best dickhead in the planet. Is that a good idea? Well, that's a problem with the virtue theory, because it's saying, hey, whatever you're gonna be a good one. It's like, well, you're gonna be a dickhead. You're gonna be a really great dickhead. That's not really what you want to tell people to do. Okay. All right, to see why this is so, consider the dilemma. Oh yeah, actually, speaking of that, evolve yourself. If you have more questions about a specific person and you don't want to put details in chat, hit me up on like Discord or something, because I have dealt with assholes before in philosophy, and maybe we can discuss. If you need like specific things. Okay, to see why this is so, consider the dilemma that Jose Gascon presents as confronting any virtuistic evaluation of arguments. Either A, one takes argumentative virtues as the basis from which the quality of arguments derive, or B, one admits that cogency is not to be defined in terms of qualities of the arguer. Option A clashes with a widespread and well-established intuition that arguments should be evaluated on their own merits, regardless of who puts them forward. On the other hand, option B leads to a gap in virtue argumentation theory regarding argument quality. Yeah, because if you're saying you don't have to be cogent when you argue, that seems like a pretty deficient way of looking at arguments. You have to at least be consistent within like your little realm. Gascon takes option B, whereas I maintain that option A is viable. How can option A be reconciled with Gascon's widespread and well-established intuition? As Gascon observes, a virtuous arguer can put forward a bad argument, and a vicious arguer can put forward a cogent argument. A perfectly virtuous arguer ex hypothesis would only ever advance good arguments. However, it is unclear whether there are any perfectly virtuous arguers or how we should recognize them if they exist. Instead, if there are typically virtuous arguers who can certainly put forward bad arguments from time, there are typically virtuous arguers who can certainly put forward bad arguments from time to time. Yeah, everyone makes mistakes. Like, this is not a unless you're a saint, you're not making perfect arguments. Like a logical saint, that would be. Okay. However, they're not arguing virtuously. Lumpy. I'm sorry, I love that little video. Lumpy, how you doing? We potato raid. What were you up to? Were you doing more, what was that, Minecraft I saw you doing the other day? I don't know if you're still doing Minecraft. Welcome in, welcome in. Let's get Lumpy a little shout out. Yes, Minecraft as always. Yeah, I was lurking your stream the other day, and I remember Aristotle once saying, like, you make these giant things, like, complicated things. I was like, I wonder how giant and complicated it was. So I go look, and it's giant and complicated. I'm like, wow, that's like an impressive thing. I have no interest myself in Minecraft, which is kind of interesting to me. I'm like, why would I spend time doing this? I build other things, not that. But it's like, yeah, I saw the castle the other day. Like, I saw part of it. It was a few days ago. It was like a morning stream or something for me. I don't know. So it was earlier in the day, or maybe later for you. I forget where you are. But yeah, I saw some of that. You had like some reference image you were going off of. Hey, Juggling Biohazard, what's up? What's the topic? We're talking about accusing people of making bad arguments. And like, if you don't have like evidence, you're just saying like, no, you screwed up. What's that actually, like, what does that count as? Like, accusing people of like, because someone was saying earlier, who was that? Teamworm was here. And saying, like, this is how people do it on the internet. Like, if you're arguing against people, you'd be like, well, you're arguing fallaciously. You haven't done that. But then you're not giving evidence. Like, what kind of actual bad argumentation is that? Exactly. It's YouTube comments. So that's why this is a kind of a fun paper, because you can read into both politics and internet arguments in this way. Yeah, so Lumpy, I saw the main castle. If anyone doesn't know Lumpy, they're super smart dude, chemist, I believe. And, yeah, and they go on Twitch and they make like giant, like sort of fantasy castles, and it's very cool. So, but like what we're doing here, if anyone doesn't know me, I'm Nogre0, No Gray, whatever you want to call me, I don't care. Thanks again for the raid, but like we're reading about, you know, What is it to accuse people of like arguing badly? And what's interesting about this author is a virtue ethicist and saying, look, maybe there's like virtues of arguing well. And what does that actually mean? Then is it like not being coherent or not being cogent? Is that like, could you be someone who argues well but then screws up sometimes? And what does that count as? And could you be a vicious person, someone who has all bad answers but then never contradicts themselves, never makes a fallacious argument? What does that mean? So that's what we're kind of talking about now. How do we understand what it is to argue well? And this is in the journal Argumentation. So this is sort of not exactly your typical philosophy, but it's definitely a philosophy-aligned journal. So it's like it's a journal of philosophy, but it's maybe not what people are always thinking about. It's talking about arguing about stuff. But like, yeah, as I said, this person's an Aristotelian. I believe we've read papers from this person on stream before. So they're like a virtue ethicist. Yeah, so thanks again for the raid. Appreciate it. Yeah, and as always, anyone who's coming in stream, feel free to ask questions. Let me know. It's my first time reading this too. This is just what I do here. I get a random paper and I read it and, you know, live sort of react to it. So I screw up. Happens. I don't really care. It's not a big deal. Most of these authors, no one reads their papers anyway, so they're super happy. The idea that anyone's even reading it badly. Alright, so here we go. Yeah, so there are typically virtuous arguers who can certainly put forward bad arguments from time to time. No one's perfect. Yeah, but the author says, however, they are not arguing virtuously in doing so. Okay, so this immediately says, look, are you just begging the question right here? So every time they screw up, they're not virtuous anymore. It's like, that's not how virtues work, man. Like, yeah, maybe you're not acting virtuously, but you still have to call them virtuous generally. Like, someone who has a good virtues is a virtuous person. That it's not like it is kind of an error theory. You're only acting well most of the time. Yes, they're not acting virtuously every time, but like, is that like just, you know, ducking out of responsibility here and saying, well, okay, they're virtuous, but not always. Okay. Likewise, a vicious arguer can put forward a good argument on occasion, but only by arguing as a virtuous arguer would argue. Not so sure about this, but okay. Thus, the practical measure of argument quality available to the virtue theorist is not whether the arguers are actually virtuous, perhaps an impossible question to answer. Yeah, this is like, what does that mean to argue virtuously? But whether they are arguing as virtuous arguers would argue. But again, who the fuck would know what a virtuous arguer would argue if they're like, who knows what a virtuous arguer would argue? This is like asking, what would Jesus do? And this happened in the history of philosophy. G.E. Moore, who was one of the top philosophers at the turn of last century, he became Christian for a year because he ran into a theologian. The theologian said, look, to be Christian is very easy. Just ask, what would Jesus do in every situation that you're confused about? And then you do that thing. And that's all you have to do to be Christian. And so he did that for a full year. And then at the end of the year, he realized he had no fucking clue what Jesus would do. And then he stopped being Christian. But like, do you know what a virtuous arguer would do? I don't know what a virtuous arguer would do. I try not to fuck up my arguments. Does that make me a virtuous arguer? I don't know. Maybe. Okay. What this standard actually comprises may not be so very different from what more conventional accounts of good argument propose. At least it should not be any laxer. Good arguing will still be expected to start from true premises and reason to conclusions that follow from them with certainty or high likelihood. Okay, so they're just defaulting to the standard shit. We don't even know if that's it. This is just how we describe it. This is not a causal argument. This is just describing what we say, and this is not how you actually get to be a good arguer by doing this. This is a description of what non-fucked up arguing is, but it doesn't tell you actually how to do it well. Okay. Author says, but this is good arguing precisely because it is how a virtuous arguer is overwhelmingly likely to argue. Thus, evaluate arguments on the basis of who puts them forward with its disturbing echoes of Proposition 3 above and its relatives is not a proposal that a virtue theorist of argument should embrace, and nor is it a serious rival to the familiar standard, evaluate arguments on their own merits. Okay, so they're admitting they don't actually have a good thing because they're defaulting to evaluate arguments on their own merits, not what it is to be virtuous. Fine. So authors at least a little self-aware here, that they don't know what a perfectly virtuous arguer would do. They just have to default to what most people think how to do argument evaluation should go. Okay. Rather, when properly understood, these are two different incomplete descriptions of the same strategy. Evaluate arguments on their own merits as manifest in the actions of the arguers who put them forward and are otherwise engaged in them. Yeah, so you still have to look at the person who's arguing and what they're arguing, because if they're a shit person, that doesn't always mean you have to listen to them. Every so often, you can just ignore the fuck out of someone because they're a terrible person and you don't want to listen to anything they say. Especially about being a good person. Like, a terrible person does not understand what it is to be a good person. Why should you take their word for it? Even if they are arguing well, it would seem that they don't actually know at all what they're talking about. You're denying them even their premises. Okay. Author says, this cluster of errors can shed some light on political phenomena that have lately attracted concern and theoretical discussion, including issue alignment, the tendency of individuals to coincide their views even across not obviously linked issues, such as abortion and immigration, and effective polarization, the degeneration of political disagreement into acrimony and vitriol. Suppose that you and I disagree about some issue, say P, and that I believe, rightly or wrongly, that I have found one or more fallacies in your arguments. By proposition 3, I could reason from the fallaciousness of your argument to the badness of your character, justifying my treating you with hostility, increasing the severity of my disagreement, and leading to polarization. If I then learn of your opinions on some other issue, say Q, on which I have no strong feelings, and perhaps even share your opinions, I can employ the converse of proposition 3. That's a saying, like, that if you argue badly, you're moral. Like, that goes to your morals. To infer that your arguments must be fallacious because of your terrible character. Yeah, so it's like saying, look, since we disagree about, say, some bridge, I can now also say that since you have terrible character about the bridge, that you're also wrong about some other political things, say, like zoning laws. Okay, lastly, by rebutting the argument, I conclude that you must be wrong about the other argument, and that I should disagree with you about this as well as the first argument, leading to issue alignment. Notice that a virtue theory of argument does not endorse any of these steps. If I find fallacies in your arguments, proposition 3a licenses me to revise my opinion of your argumentative character downwards, but does not justify any reappraisal of your moral character. Even if I conclude that your argumentative character is very bad, that does not in itself justify my treating you with hostility. And while I should treat your argument about Q with greater skepticism if I take your argumentative character to be poor, I should still take those arguments seriously and could still end up accepting your conclusion, perhaps for other reasons. Again, as I was saying earlier, someone can be right, but for the wrong reasons. Like, they can argue terribly, but still come up with the right answer. This happens all the time. I do it, you do it. It's not a big deal. Like, you just have to realize sometimes you don't have all the information, and so you get to the right answer, but then you find out, oh, well, I didn't have all the information. What I said was technically wrong. It's like, that's a common thing. But it's still like, okay. So it's like one of these things. Should we have worn masks at the beginning of the pandemic? Yes. Were the reasons they gave at the beginning of the pandemic completely correct? No. Should we have worn masks at the end of the pandemic knowing what we know now? Yes. It's like, this actually did help, because at first we didn't think it was airborne, so why you were wearing masks? It was like you were touching stuff. It doesn't matter. But like, it turned out we were wrong about like the airborne or whatever, and so the masks did help. It's like, that was the right thing. We were at the right answer for the wrong reasons. But, you know, on average, you should be more safe. And so it was like, that's kind of like we should have defaulted to the safe thing instead of going crazy about it. But it's like, this is how things go. Okay, the Owl of Minerva. Oh yeah, so I have not read this author. This author is talking about Scott Aiken, who we have read. That's what I should have said earlier. Apologies. Okay, Scott Aiken and Robert Talisse have recently posed the Owl of Minerva problem, named by allusion to the Hegelian dictum that the Owl of Minerva flies only at dusk, as they gloss this aphorism, quote, Minerva's owl, a symbol of wisdom, is active only at the end of the day when all the deeds are done. One reason we believe this is the case is that we humans are changed by our insights, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. We and our theories about ourselves have a looping pattern. We have concepts of ourselves, and they at once function both as descriptive and prescriptive of our behavior. Okay, end quote. Such loops can be virtuous, reinforcing newly acquired positive behaviors or positive patterns of behavior until they become entrenched, but they can also be vicious. The newly conceptual framework can open up new possibilities for error. And this happens to me all the time, actually. It's very annoying. One thing that happens is I change my mind about something, and then all of a sudden I'm using different ideas, and I make new mistakes that I wouldn't have made in the past. And it's kind of funny. It's like, why did I make new mistakes that I normally didn't do in the past as well? You also have the possibility for doing new things, but then you can screw up stuff that you didn't used to screw up too. This is part of the fun of being me. It's like I screw new things up that I never fucked up before, and I'm like, I did that 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, can I fix this? I can fix it. But it's like, I was like, why the fuck did I do that stupid thing? It's like, well, I changed my mind about stuff, and then all of a sudden, I'm doing things differently. All of a sudden, you do things differently. New possibilities for error. Okay. On Aiken's account, the fallacy originates in just such a vicious loop. The fallacy is possible only if we have the concept of fallacy. Teaching fallacy theory makes a whole new kind of fallacy possible. Yeah, so you have to know what a fallacy is to accuse somebody of it. And this is the danger. It's like you're giving a kid a weapon. It's like, okay, you gave a kid a weapon. Maybe you shouldn't have given them the weapon because now they're going to hit somebody with it. Yeah. Aiken, like many who have taught this material, is concerned lest his students become what Edward Dahmer dubs fallacy mongers. Some people with little knowledge of fallacious reasoning develop a kind of obsession with identifying fallacies in the utterances of others. They sniff suspiciously at every argument and point of debate. Such pouncing on others often creates alienation. The fallacy monger is an inveterate perpetrator of fallacies. Yeah, and this is the internet problem. This is the fallacy monger is like what you get on social media. People just accusing each other of reasoning poorly because this sounds like a good attack. It's like, I know what I'm talking about. You are making a fallacy, and then so the fact that then the person has to respond to that saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about. But that's hard because then you have to explain why you have to defend yourself and explain why they're wrong. So this is one of these very cheapy things, and that's why it happens on the internet so much. People accusing each other of being wrong and making fallacies. Okay, David Godin has observed that the Owl of Minerva problem, the worsening of our discursive circumstances following on our attempts to make explicit the norms of our practices, gives rise to two importantly distinct faults. It may be accidental or deliberate. This mirrors a traditional distinction in fallacy theory between paralogisms, innocent mistakes in reasoning, and sophisms designed to deceive. In each case, it is the latter, willful variety of problem that presents the greater hazard, as is apt to be incorrigible. As Godin explains, it lends itself to a cynical, bad faith approach to argument, reminiscent of that proposed ironically by Schopenhauer. Quote, "The thought that we may keep two sets of rational books, one private and one public, where acceptability is established and entitlement secured in some private ledger of reason, which is unaccountable to public audit, while the book of public reason, for example, reasoned discourse in the publics of deliberative democracy, merely record exercises of rhetorical power whereby acceptance is coerced." Yeah, so basically, if you're saying, okay, I know who is right and who is wrong, but you don't have to show people who's right and who's wrong, and then you can only say, look, some people are actually right, but we're going to say they're wrong, and some people are just sophistical, they're arguing well, and we're going to say they're right. So, this is where it is a dangerous sort of game to, get to decide who's right and who's wrong. Okay, thus Godin is concerned about arguers who prioritize winning at all costs. Elsewhere, I've distinguished between real winners who win the argument deservedly because they are in the right, and mere winners who win the argument undeservedly because they are in the wrong. Where winning the argument consists in convincing the audience and achieving what is presumptively independent of the facts that determine whether an arguer is in the right or in the wrong. You can think of this in sort of a courtroom setting. You may get your client off for the right reasons, or you may get them off being guilty for the wrong reasons, but again, it's did you win the case? Yes, you won the case. So, okay, with such priorities, arguers may settle for mere winning even when they know they are in the wrong. This is the perspective identified by Katarina Stevens and Daniel Cohen as the adversarial attitude. Arguers with adversarial attitudes behave in ways that enhance their prospects of winning, including behavior intended to prevent reasons which might work against their goals from being recognized. Stevens and Cohen distinguish the adversarial attitude from the less compromising adversarial stance required of an arguer fulfilling the adversarial function of an argument. Yeah, because you can take a position, but you don't have to be trying to win at all costs. Nonetheless, they deprecate the overemphasis of the adversarial function within what Cohen has determined the dominant adversarial model. Damn. As Cohen complains, this model is substantially incomplete. The dominant adversarial model account cannot make any sense of arguers who walk away from an argument having had their positions changed, either by winning or losing or listening and learning, and declaring it a good argument on that account. In the Rawlsian terms, damn is an ideal theory. Modern damn theories come with the promise that following the rules will bring reality close enough to the ideal, but rules cannot replace genuine cooperative attitudes, nor can they preclude the impacts of adversarial attitudes. Realistic engagement with argumentative practice requires non-ideal theory. Yeah, does anyone actually think that a courtroom is going to get to the actual truth? Sometimes it does. Courtrooms can sort of tease apart when who's lying and who isn't, but not always. No one thinks it's ideal, what's going on in a courtroom. So it's this is the idea. It's if you have people that are just trying to get the upper hand, it's whatever. It's not going to work. You're not going to inherently get the truth if someone is not playing fair. Okay. Vice charging. The Owl of Minerva problem does not only afflict theories of argument, it is a potential problem for any theory that involves explicit reflection on the norms of our practices. Of course, that includes virtues and vices, so it is reasonable to anticipate that this apparatus can give us the resources to create hitherto unthinkable varieties of vice. Ian James Kidd provides a helpful context for such reflection in his discussion of vice charging. For Kidd, a vice charge is a threefold relationship between a critic, a target, and an audience. The critic accuses the target of some vice, typically in front of an audience. Each of the three might but need not benefit from the charge. Hence, he can draw a distinction between two species of vice charge, which I will term heuristic and robust. Heuristic charges involve reportage of one's negative judgments, but do not represent any reason, evidence, or feelings in support of them, so they do not do any real critical work. They might simply let off steam, vent frustration, or register disapproval. A robust charge involves primarily an active and intentional attempt to persuade others, perhaps a target, perhaps an audience, for the ultimately ameliorative reason of making things better. Okay, so basically you're saying ugh, that's terrible, and you're just unhappy about it. But other ones you might say, look, the latter is we're trying to be robust about it. It's you're wrong for this reason because we can fix your argument, or we have to understand why you're wrong so no one else makes this mistake. Okay, for the latter benign variety of vice charge to succeed, requires a suitable account of epistemic responsibility and a broad consensus, critically including the target, as to what the vice comprises and whether the case at issue exemplifies it. Yeah, if you're trying to fix something, you have to be, clear about what's going on and be nice about it. None of this is easily done, so Kidd unsurprisingly concludes that robust critical practice of epistemic vice charging is possible in principle, but very difficult in practice. As Qasim Qasim observes, the biggest pitfall of vice charging is the ever-present temptation to see epistemic vice every time one encounters a group of nonconformists whose views or conduct are fundamentally different from one's own. That is, it lends itself to the same sort of type 1 error noted above as underpinning the fallacy. Yeah, if you just see everyone as different as being morally bad, then okay, and you're going to say, well, everything they do is bad because these are just terrible people, but that's unfair. Just because they're different, you're pinning bad reasoning to a bad moral character. And that's unfair. Okay. Godden's subdivision of the pernicious effect of the Owl of Minerva problem extends to heuristic vice charging. A vicious vice charging consisting of comparatively harmless venting and the like is naive. A more sinister attempt to discredit the other party is cynical. Yeah, if you call them a moron and you think you're just venting, that's one thing. But if you're calling them a moron to discredit them, you're being a jerk, or you could be cynical about that. The former includes the more benign varieties of heuristic dialogue or quarrel discussed by Douglas Watson and Eric C. Crabb, whereby powerful repressed feelings that could otherwise cause constant disruption and violent physical demonstrations of unrest or frustration are released. I love this. This is like the old sort of hydraulic theory where you've got like nervous energy you got to get out from the 1800s, where they thought like the brain was working on like hydraulic pressure. It's like you just got to get it out of you. Get that pressure out. The latter is perhaps exemplified by the dominant aspect of what Justin Tozzi and Brandon Warmk call moral grandstanding, the use of moral talk to enhance one's social status. Some grandstanders use moral talk for dark purposes. They grandstand to dominate others. They use moral talk to shame or silence others and to create fear. They verbally threaten and seek to humiliate. They try to impress people by derogating their rivals. Just as cynical cases of fallacy mongering are likely to prove more incorrigible than naive ones because they further the dialectical goals of the arguer, vice charging pursued for the cynical goal of improving the social status of the vice charger through an exercise of dominance should be expected to be harder to remedy than more careless cases. Yeah, like if I'm saying you're a terrible person, I'm like, oh, I have moral standing, like I'm a better person than you are because you're a dumbass and you argue badly, then that's harder because I'm trying to make myself look like I'm good on top of saying you screwed up. But that's a harder thing because then people think, well, I'm some paragon of morality. And if people start believing that, then they're going to start taking what I say more seriously and what you say less seriously, even if it's unfair. Okay. Vicious vice charging is related to many more familiar vices in the long history of vice and virtue talk. It has echoes both of self-righteousness and the implicit assumption that the critic is free of the vice at issue, and of hypocrisy in the likelihood that the critic is in fact also guilty of the selfsame vice. But the vice which matches it most closely is perhaps moralism. As defined by Alfred Archer, this comprises an inflated sense of the extent to which moral criticism is appropriate. Critically, as with other offspring of the Owl of Minerva, it depends on a reflective awareness of our own normative practices, and it works to undermine those practices. It is a vice that threatens our ability to persuade others that their behavior is unacceptable. So where the fallacy is a fallacy that arises from misapplication of fallacy charging, moralism is a vice which arises from misapplication of vice charging. If, as I have suggested elsewhere, fallaciousness may be grounded in the vices of arguer and audience, moralism should have a counterpart applicable to argumentation that grounds the fallacy. Moralism is not among the argumentative vices that I've hitherto proposed, but is closely related to two of them. Misplaced zeal, a subtype of undue willingness to engage in argumentation, and unfairness to others in evaluating their arguments, a subtype of unwillingness to listen to others. There is no reason to expect each fallacy to correspond to a unique vice. If anything, we should expect the contrary. So I tentatively ascribe the fallacy to the conjunction of these two vices. Okay, so basically we finally got down, this is a little bit in the weeds here, but basically what they're saying is that they've broken it down to you're not willing to engage in argumentation by just blindly accusing other people of having fallacies, which again is a self-defensive move, as they were just saying. They're an undue willingness to engage in argumentation. What you're doing is accusing someone else of arguing poorly, and in doing so, you're being unfair to their arguments, and so they have to then defend their arguments while attacking you, puts the burden on them unfairly. So this is why this is such a widespread thing. This is kind of giving you reasons to understand why it's a cheap and easy way to argue on the internet, and why so many people do it, because it's scoring them easy points on the internet. You're wasting someone else's time very easily, and that's what the internet, modern tech runs on, is eyeballs. Like how long you're engaging with a topic, and anytime you can waste your opponent's time more than yours, then you're going to win just by the eyeball fight. Okay. The Lark of Aberdein. What's to be done? Godin's account of the Owl of Minerva problem provides grounds for optimism as well as pessimism. The problem may be technical technically eliminable, but is technically eliminable, but it is typically remediable. The same self-awareness which enables the cynical to devise new ways to exploit our normative practices also enables the well-intentioned to develop their argumentative virtues. Really? So you're going to tell us how to stop arguing on the internet now? Let's find out. Godin thus proposes a beneficent sibling for the Owl of Minerva, the Lark of Aberdein. Where the pessimistic Owl of Minerva makes possible a kind of vicious cycle of incompetence, the optimistic Lark of Aberdein makes possible a virtuous cycle of autonomous mastery and virtuosity. The Lark of Aberdein thereby opens up the prospect of converting a behavior into an action, a habit into a practice, a creature into an agent into a virtuoso, and a public of arguers into a culture of argumentative virtuosity. What are the implications for argumentative virtues and vices? Oh, they're not going to do it. They're just going to give the theory here. That is so disappointing. They're just saying we could possibly all get ourselves into being virtuous argumentators. They're not going to tell us how, though. Oh, that's so sad. I wanted a suggestion here because it was never going to work. It's so hard to say these things. But like, this is the whole point. If you're going to say, oh, you can all be like screwing with each other's arguments on the internet, how do you do it well, though? They're not going to say. Okay. What are the implications for argumentative virtues and vices? As discussed in section 2, virtues should be seen as situation responsive. This sensitivity to circumstance requires help from other virtues, either as part of a web of interacting virtues or by appeal to regulatory virtues. With respect to argumentation, there are several candidates for the latter role, including humility and phronesis. In either case, this suggests that becoming argumentatively virtuous enough to routinely argue in virtuous ways is no small task. Indeed, the naive arguer is unlikely even to fully understand the scale of the task. So, excuse me. So, with argumentative vices and ever-present temptation, how does anyone ever come close to meeting the standards? Here, the Lark of Aberdein comes to our aid. Godin echoes Agnes Collard's concept of acting on a proleptic reason, by virtue of values which we aspire to but do not yet possess. As he explains, even a naive arguer may pursue improvement through the increasingly purposive self-regulation of future action. The fallacy is thus a symptom of how reflection on our own norms can be abused, but such reflection is also integral to the acquisition of the virtuous character necessary for good argument. So, basically, get good is what this person just said right here. We have to just try to be better, and we are literally being told, by virtue of values which we aspire to but do not yet possess. This is called a get good argument. Like, really. Get good. Trolling power up to 9. Yeah. Exactly, juggling by Howard. Like, so this is what they're saying. If you don't want to deal with trolls, you have to just get good at arguing, and like, you can try to always be better at it, but it's like, okay, that's not like super like helpful, but like, okay, yeah, if you get good at arguing, you can do it. I mean, if I had to give someone like kudos for doing it well, you can go look at our buddy Aristotle. Everyone like here probably knows who he is. First link there. He does he will take, like, people come into his chat, they say like hard questions, and he's good at it. He can argue well. He has the virtue of being able to like understand how to deal with these people. I deal with it differently. I'm just like, fuck off. I don't care. Like, I have less of a fuck to give, I think. And that's a different method of dealing with people, which is maybe not as good for me because I don't engage as well, I think, as he does. So it's like, but like, how do you actually do this? Like, do you actually, like, every time, like, the Owl of Minerva looks like you have to, like, every time you learn something, you have to reevaluate everything, and you can't really, so you're paralyzed. But this one is like, well, you can virtuously get better and better by shooting for ever higher standards. Even if you don't actually have those, the knowledge at the time, you can shoot for them and then get it eventually. So how do we do this? How do we become actually good at this? I don't know. But see, this is the generally Juggling says, love how he takes a troller's comments and actually frames into perspective and gives good arguments. Yeah, it's super impressive how he does that. Like, I'm not as good as he is at doing, like, taking questions and, reframing that into, like, something that's actually kind of, like, worth talking about. It's like, it's great skill, like, to actually, appreciate people and see where, like, there is actually a kernel of something worth discussing. It is impressive. Yeah, so what do I have to say about this? Now, here's the question. Was this paper well argued? Because if it wasn't, it would be very hard to believe this author. Like, could we just call them out on the fallacy right here? Be like, well, maybe if their argument was better, we should take their conclusion. But since their conclusion is a philosophical conclusion, we don't actually have independent reason to believe that they're right. So we can just be like, well, if you can't even argue for it, why should we listen to you about arguing? Since there is nothing here. Yes, exactly. Juggling biohazards. We can go fallacyception on this. I don't think it was poorly argued. I think this is reasonably well argued for what it is. They have a position within this literature. They are virtue argumentation theorists. They think that you can argue virtuously as opposed to viciously, even though it's flaky as fuck. What that means. I was pointing that out up here. Like, we don't actually know what it is to argue like virtuously or like as a perfectly virtuous arguer would do. It's very like this here. How would a virtuous argue? No one actually knows because no one's a perfectly virtuous arguer. So it's like, yeah, if you're going to have the position, then you're actually like, there's no way to get around this. Like, that no one knows what a perfectly virtuous person would do. So you just have to like bite the metaphysical bullet in some sense and say, look, I'm going to be arguing from the position of a virtue theory. Which is fine, but like, you can't be pretending like that you have a great argument for this because you just don't. Like, no one does. But in that sense, from that position, can you talk about interesting stuff? And did they argue for their point reasonably well? That like, yeah, if you assume a virtue theory, can we talk about this stuff? And nice, and could you get better at it? Yes. And so it's like, well, what else can you talk about that was good here? Well, it was nice in some sense to talk about all the little distinctions about what it is to like screw with other people on the internet here, like what it is to accuse someone else of like not arguing well, and why that wrong foots people so much, and why it gets used all the time, because it's an easy way to wrong foot somebody. And they are doing a good job of explaining how that works a bit here. Now the question is, did they actually need the virtue theory to do that? Maybe not, actually. They could have just argued this straight and just said, look, this is why it wrong foots someone. They would lose calling it a vice, but they could have they'd have to say something similar. They'd say it'd be in bad faith, or it'd be basically bad faith. You're arguing something isn't right. You're just doing it to win, which again would have ended up moralizing it just the same. So did they, on their own standards, I think they held it together. So I don't want to be like, no, they didn't. They screwed up on their own standards. By their own standards, they did fine. This seems like a well-argued paper about argumentation, and that's why it's in the journal Argumentation. And what I would have liked is more examples of I don't know how old this person is. They did a very good job, I think, actually, they referenced a lot of people, and philosophy tends to be very bad of this. So this is in I was like, this is in Melbourne, but then it said Florida. So there's Melbourne, Florida. Interesting. Okay, but like, yeah. So they did a very good job of like talking about a lot of different people. So this is interesting. This is part of their argumentation, is to bring in a lot of references too. Oh, I was gonna say something. Yeah. Oh, I would have wanted some more contemporary examples of the internet. They did once mention the political situation, but if they had actually picked out some funny, they could have had plenty of funny examples from like online discourse, and we've seen that before. That could have made this a little bit of a little bit of fun. Could have thrown in there just for some levity in the middle of this paper. It wouldn't have even added a whole lot of space to it. Anywho, if anyone has any questions, comments, please let me know at this point.